Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I think I'll make a start. It's James Pitcher here from ZN. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar on smart ledgers and collective defined contribution pensions. This is me. I'm James Pitcher. I'm the Program Director of the Distributed Futures Research Program. And just briefly today, what we're going to cover, I'm going to spend 2 or 3 minutes giving you an introduction to the Distributed Futures Research Program. I'm then going to hand over to Con Keating, who's one of the authors and a renowned expert in this field. There will be time for questions, which you can type as you go through by pressing the appropriate button on the top right-hand side of your screen. Hopefully, if there are any, Con will either address those as we go through or at the end, and then there will be some very brief concluding remarks from myself. So this webinar is going to be a summary of the report that we published in July. It's available on the Long Finance website or at the abbreviated link shown on the screen at the moment. For those of you that are not familiar with the ZN Group, ZN is the City of London's leading commercial think tank, established in 1994. Long Finance is effectively the pro bono arm, the research arm, comprising 4 major research programs: Distributed Futures, which I'll talk about briefly for you in a second, Financial Centres Futures Index, and by the way, for those of you that are interested, GFCI, that index number 24 has been published today, so do have a look at that, Eternal Coin, and MetaCommerce. Distributed Futures program evolved from a forum that was designed to share intelligence on fintech and regtech, where disruptive technology meets finance. It's now also an open source research program for smart ledgers and new technologies. And the research is structured around 4 themes: society, technology, economic and political, and directed at 4 outcomes. And we'll talk about these outcomes or themes a bit: expanding frontiers, changing systems, delivering services, and building communities. In terms of our definition, this webinar on pensions very much falls under the social and expanding frontiers heading. The Distributed Futures Research Program is sponsored by Cardano Foundation. The foundation's mission is the promotion of developments and of new technologies and applications, especially in the fields of new, open, and decentralized software architectures. Here are some other examples of the reports that have been launched recently. We're trying, as you can see, to develop an identifiable brand based on the 4 themes I talked about. We're starting, for example, to color code those. So pensions, for example, yellow, as is the scandals report, and bottom left comes under social heading, red for economic, green for political, and blue for technological. The survey is constantly evolving. We seem to be adding or amending a theme virtually on a weekly basis, but this timeline will give you an idea of the scope of the research, and we do have 4 or 5 more reports being launched this year. And as you can see, there are a wide range of smart ledger topics under each of the 4 themes, again color-coded. With cryptocurrencies constantly in the news, most of you are probably aware of the underlying technology of blockchain, but we thought that this would be a good idea, a good time to provide a kind of easily understandable term to where we get to smart ledgers particularly. So ledger obviously is a record of transactions. It becomes distributed, mutual, and mutually distributed accordingly. On the 5th point down there, the key words I would point out in terms of MDL technology are immutable. It's an immutable record of transactions, and it's stored in multiple locations through blockchain. And then smart ledger, which is where we kind of end up, is an MDL with embedded executable code, and that's very key in terms of smart ledgers in general. So my final slide then, before I hand over to Con. ZN has been researching smart ledgers for many years, and Michael Mainelli has been using this slide for many years. It gives you an idea of the various opportunities that are covered in our research and where smart ledgers hold immense promise. So cryptocurrencies, for example, which is, as I mentioned, very often in the news, and there are many of them now. That really is just the first word on this slide, which includes not just cryptocurrencies, but of course fiat currencies and everything else as well. And one, but as you can see, there are many, many more aspects. The one that resonates probably with many of us is where we talk about land and property titles. We've all been involved, I'm sure, in buying and selling property, and if you can imagine all of the data and the details that are involved in that chain, so buyer, seller, estate agent, mortgage provider, lawyers, ultimately HM Land Registry, you can see that there are immense areas for potential efficiency gains in really all of the four headings that we talked about. Interestingly, given that this perhaps is an old slide, one word that is missing from this slide is pensions. So it's probably a very good segue for me to hand over to Con to start talking about pensions in his context. Before we do, we're just going to ask you just put a very quick question out there in terms of a poll, just get an idea about how this works. And you should be able to see that on your screen now. The question is, based on what you know, do you think CDC pensions are likely to prove a significant addition to DC? You've got various responses there, very much so, possibly, have to wait and see, no, not at all. I'll just give that a few seconds to run, and then we'll share the results with you, and then I will hand over to Con. So just a few more seconds, very roughly working out at 70, well, it's just gone down, but it was 70%, yes, very much so, 30% possibly, although I think we just had a few people say we'd have to wait and see. So probably a great point, therefore, to hand over to Con. Thank you.
Let me begin by thanking you for that, James. I've never done a webinar before, so forgive me if this at points in time becomes disjointed or whatever. One thing I would encourage you to do is ask questions as they occur, and rather than trying to store questions to the end, I hope that I should be able to either answer them immediately or work in answers into the text. The other thing I will say right at the beginning is that this is going to be light on technology because I am very far from an expert on that. On the other hand, collective defined contribution pensions I have done enormous amount of work on. So let's just begin with the slides, and it's okay, I'm just now I just need to go. Right, let's just start. Sorry, so getting used to the technology here. So collective schemes, they offer targeted pensions, targeted income in requirement. The income is not fixed, it's not immutable. Targeted pensions may be cut. Now, that contrasts with DC schemes, which are simply saving schemes. And there's an income conversion issue at retirement. So intrinsically, CDC schemes are far longer than DC schemes in as much as they cover both decumulation, the cash out phase, as well as the accumulation phase, which of course is what DC is designed for. One thing to bear in mind with CDC, which has not been widely discussed, is that CDC schemes people have talked about using CDC schemes as decumulation vehicles, but CDC schemes could also be simple DC competitors as accumulation vehicles, where the member might choose to take his money away to transfer to some other arrangement at retirement. Now, the next major point to recognize is that pensions are long-term in nature and that they ultimately depend on their history. When and where and how the contributions and investment returns were made and earned matters. In other words, the outcome is strongly catenated on its own prior history. And that really is the motivation for thinking of blockchain type technologies. This question of history is also terribly relevant in as much as it is one of the areas where we have gone badly wrong in DB. The discounting done in valuation of DB schemes using either gilts or expected returns on assets does not consider the prior history of the way in which those liabilities were created or came about. And that actually does have meaning for value. So pensions are long-term in nature. They depend on their history. And the long-term projections slowly, over time, morph into realized actuality for any individual member, which means that the immutability and so on of a blockchain type arrangement is absolutely suited for examining and following the development of a pension over one's working lifetime and indeed over one's entire lifetime. Now, thing to remember about CDC schemes is it is DC. There is no recourse to any sponsor. The fund is all there is. If there isn't the money in the fund, pensions can't get paid. So an immutable record is critical. So now it's interesting. This page came up all at once. Pensions, the critical part about CDC pensions is that new awards are set by the trustees. They're taking a contribution and some basis for award. It might be a proportion of final salary or something similar. The scheme is effectively creating an implicit investment return on the contribution. That I've referred to in other documents as the contractual accrual rate. That in turn will determine how the members' interest in the scheme and in the fund progresses over time. That is going to mark the accrual from contribution to final pension entitlement as age progresses. So we've chosen in various papers to call this the members' equitable interest, which is simply what it is. It's, if you like, a pseudo liability. Can't be a liability in the traditional sense because it is upper bounded at whatever assets are in the fund. And it's a division of scheme assets, among members of the fund or of the scheme. One thing that I will just state immediately, because a lot of people have been arguing and criticizing this falsely, incorrectly. Members can actually remove their assets at the net asset value of their interest at any point in time in the life of the fund. Prior to retirement, they can transfer the fund to some other fund. At retirement, they can follow, and at and after retirement, they can either take annuitization options or drawdown, or take the money elsewhere in drawdown type formats or SIP type formats. There's complete flexibility at net asset value. And some people taking their money out at net asset value will not harm the value of the fund. Well, will harm the value of the fund, but it will not harm the interests of the other members. One of the things to realize is that we can, in this arrangement where the contractual accrual rate has been determined, and that actually is the rate of return which we need to achieve in the investment fund in order to pay benefits in full. But one of the things to remember here is that sorry, I'm losing myself in my own thoughts here, going in too many different ways at the same time. One of the things to remember about this is that with the ability to transfer, then you can immediately see at that point in time both the income value of your pension accrued to date and its capital equivalents. And that, I think, can be given to, that can go very far in building trust and confidence. One of the problems with DC is that although we may very well know the value of the fund that we are invested in, we have no idea what income that is likely to produce for us in the future. And that difference is a very important one in terms of trust and confidence. So now, the important thing about pension schemes is that they should be long-term sustainable. And that really means that they have to operate fairly, equitably between the various members. If you can achieve this fairness, then you have eliminated any possibility of intergenerational inequity. And that is, in lots of designs of DC and DB schemes, problematic. Now, it's possible for scheme rules, which can be encoded as smart contracts, rules which follow automatically, rules which don't operate on a discretionary basis, but are simply hard-coded into the scheme. That, in essence, reduces the trusteedom rules to a matter of administration, and it eliminates the need for trustee discretions. I'll come on to this again later, but even the discretionary awards made at the beginning of made at the time of contribution by trustees can be managed through the use of smart contracts. If those rewards are overgenerous, then smart contracts can cause that overgenerous award to be scaled back and the scheme to maintain equilibrium and be long-term sustainable. Now, scheme rules involve two elements, both risk pooling and risk sharing. Risk pooling we're all familiar with in the context of longevity. Put a few hundred lives together and you have statistically a very high probability of a particular average life to that collection of risks. Risk sharing is a little more complex, and this is what I want to focus on here. The thing about risk sharing that we will come to is that it's not subsidy. It's actually about allowing members to be supported by other members when markets justify such action. The thing about such risk-sharing rules is that they actually admit longer investment horizons. The investment management of a fund now is not just the target rate of return embedded in the awards given, but the presence of risk-sharing rules reduces that target to an average target over the expected horizon over which those risk-sharing rules will operate. That changes the nature of the fund management from the maximized value at all times of DC to achieve a target return on average over rather a long time. So we have mentioned that members have the rights to transfer in and out. There are a number of other forms of design of schemes, notably in Belgium, in Holland and in Germany, where risk buffers are used. There's no need, in fact, with risk sharing properly designed, there's no need for a scheme to have risk buffers. Everything can be handled as a matter of internal accounting. So let's go to the decision criterion. The criterion is the solvency ratio, assets relative to the sum total of the members' equitable interests. So if the scheme finds itself in deficit, then a support mechanism is applied. This is a self-equilibrating system. If deficits arise when trustees were over-optimistic, as I said earlier, then the rules will cut those back. If pensions in excess of those justified by the level of funding at any point in time, then if you choose to, you may pay or the rule may say, pay the pension, in which case those pensioner members have received more money than they should have done, and the necessary correction for that is, having overpaid pensioners, it is necessary to increase the equitable interest of the other members, the non-pensioner members, so that they are equally fairly treated in both circumstances. That changes the relative claim of non-pensioner to pensioner members on the assets going forward. When these rules are automated, member confidence and trust should follow automatically. This is a point I made earlier. Members may see in near real time both the net asset value and the pension income equivalent of their stake, their pot. So data requirements are all the predictable ones, the usual static data. The assumptions used by trustees when setting contributions, and this is slowly modified over time as people's wages change, and real data is added into this, indexation and all such things. Contribution and the car awards histories are made, as well as corrections arising from the operation of risk sharing arrangements. The pension fund has a target return on average mandate. The average is determined by the extent of the risk sharing allowed and its current utilization. Those risk sharing rules can also operate over time, and there should be a related set of rules dealing with the time over which deficits may be tolerated or compensated for. The system also needs an administration requirement, which is absolutely basic: receipt of contributions, payment pensions, and so on. In the paper, we assume the existence of the Smart Ledger platform. The key considerations is it's multi-chain. There are a chain for assets, there's a chain for every member, there's a chain for the scheme as a whole. The structure is strongly permissioned. The number of people who can change any or add any new entry is extremely limited, and it's managed through smart contracts. I'm not going to dwell on these diagrams. They are self-evident types of chain. What I will do is just go, well, let's come back one. This is some of the detail that you will see for each of the members, then contributions and looking at single member chain. Read the paper itself for a lot more detail on this side of things. What I did want to do is just go to this diagram, which is a process flow diagram, and it illustrates where smart contracts can apply. It's each and every point where this flow diagram for the member or for the trustee bifurcates or comes back together. All of these operations can be automated and handled by smart contracts. This is an example of one area. where you may be looking at funding, and funding is yes or no adequately funded, then in which case you either go off and calculate the surplus or the payments, or calculate the surplus and then indeed the payments, because it's perfectly possible that schemes might have rules which distribute excess assets when a scheme is in surplus, as well as having a situation where pensions might be cut if in deficit. Right. There's a question about the way that risk sharing would work. Suppose the scheme is in deficit, in the sense of 80% funded, that is to say that the promises made to members are 20% or 25% more than the assets of the scheme. Now, in that situation, pensions should not be paid in full in a given year. The current pension should be cut to the level of 80% of that which was targeted. If the pension is cut, then you have to cut the equitable interest of all other non-pensional members as well. That's the simple situation where there is no risk sharing, and well, there is risk sharing to the extent that pensioners get cut. If pensioners get cut, then all other members have to get cut. Now, if the pension is alternately paid in full, then that member has received more than that which they were rightly entitled to, and the other members of the scheme can allow such payments, and the quid pro quo for that, in order to maintain them in a fair or equitable position, is that you increase the equitable interests of those non-pensioner members by a similar proportion to that which you paid the pensioner members in that year. Don't forget, we're only talking about a single year here, so the relative proportions relative to the overall value of the fund and so on are actually quite small. I mean, if, for example, the scheme was paying 5% of its assets in pensions in a year, which is the sort of sum you might see from a mature scheme, like a DB scheme currently would be, then 80%, 1% is the amount of, 80% of that 5% is funded, 1% is in excess. That's how much support the other members have offered to the pensioners, and they in turn need to be compensated by having their interests in the fund increased in similar proportion. Okay, thank you for that question. Do please ask further questions as they come along. Now, returning to where we were, we're really running towards the end of this presentation. The outline here is quite simply a CDC scheme, forgive me, is a member mutual collective. It looks as if the master trust mechanism that we're familiar with from DC anyway may be the specific form to do this. If that is the route we choose, or the Department of Work and Pensions chooses to go, it will have one further major advantage, which is if this is a master trust and recognized as such by the pensions regulator and the Inland Revenue, then recharacterization of the scheme as a liability of some sponsor would be completely impossible. I really do think we need to embed the contractual accrual rate. The other members there are simply that. Let's just go to the very last slide, which is the smart ledger side of things. Automation over the very long term is clearly the way of the future. It's also terribly important in terms of managing and reducing the administration costs of a scheme. One of the concerns will be evident in the consultation paper shortly to come from the Department of Work and Pensions is the position of the charge cap. And administration along these lines could keep one well within the charge cap. They'd also, smart ledgers also make the whole process, they embed the whole process of governance and transparency. They are adjustment rules. They embed risk pooling and risk sharing. And indeed, they could immediately be fed to dashboards or indeed offer variations on dashboards themselves. Now, that's the end of my presentation. And if there are any questions, let's hear them now. And of course, you can always send me emails with other questions which occur later.
Okay, thank you so much, Con, for that very detailed insight. I found that fascinating. Thank you so much. As Con mentioned, the slides and the recording of the webinar will be available on the Disputed Futures website very shortly. I would just like to close with a final poll that will help us understand the value of these and learn as we go forward. And so that's coming up on your screen in a second. If I can just get this to work, 1 second. Okay, so here we go. Did this event meet your expectations? The options there are for you to answer now. If you wouldn't mind, please. Yes, largely, to some extent, or no. I'll just give that a few seconds to run. I'll share those results with you, and that'll be there on the website for you as well. So just a few more seconds, and then I'll finish, wrap up. Just a couple of minutes over schedule, but hopefully that's been very interesting for you. So listen, 80% said yes, did meet their expectations, 20% largely. So great job, Con. Thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Con. Thank you and goodbye from us.